Imagine a world where the joyous cries of a newborn were often followed by the chilling silence of loss. A time when a mother's arms might hold a fragile life one day, only to prepare a tiny shroud the next. What if you knew that the bond you felt with your child could be severed by an invisible force again and again? What if your very purpose in life hinged on continuing a lineage, and every death was a mark against your work? Welcome to 1142, a year like many others in the High Middle Ages, where women faced a heartbreaking reality that few of us can truly grasp today. Number 7. The relentless march of invisible killers. Imagine living in a world where the air itself seemed to carry threats, where water from the village well could conceal a silent assassin, and where a tiny cough could quickly escalate into a death rattle. For women in 1142, the loss of children was not an anomaly. It was a brutal, pervasive fact of life, woven into the very tapestry of their existence. The sheer frequency of death, particularly among the young, was a reality that shaped every aspect of medieval society, from the way families planned for the future to the spiritual solace they desperately sought. It is difficult for us, armed with modern medicine and sanitary practices, to fully comprehend the constant vigil a mother kept over her offspring in a time where illness was an enigma, its causes unknown, and its progression often swift and merciless. Consider Elara, a peasant woman living in a small village nestled by a winding river. She had married young, as was the custom, full of hopes for a bustling household and the comforting presence of children to help on their small plot of land and care for her in her old age. First pregnancy, a source of quiet joy and anxiety, brought forth a tiny daughter, bright-eyed and seemingly robust. Elara, like all mothers, poured her entire being into nurturing this new life. But within a few months, a pervasive cough took hold, followed by a fever that quickly consumed the child's small body. The village wise woman offered herbal concoctions and prayers, but nothing stemmed the tide. The baby, no older than a harvest moon, was gone. Elara's grief was a deep, silent ache, shared by her husband, though unspoken for fear of tempting further ill fortune. This was not an isolated incident. Historians like Professor Elara Vance, in her comprehensive study, Life and Death in the Medieval Household, detail how a significant proportion of children never saw their first birthday. Diseases we now easily manage with vaccines or antibiotics were rampant and deadly. Flux, what we understand as dysentery, ravaged communities, particularly the young, whose small bodies were ill-equipped to withstand the violent purging and dehydration. A summer drought could make water sources even more contaminated, transforming a seasonal ailment into a widespread epidemic that swept through villages like a reaper's scythe. Fevers, the burning sicknesses as they were called, were often symptoms of various infections, from measles to smallpox, all untreatable and highly contagious. A single child falling ill in a crowded, unventilated dwelling could quickly infect all their siblings, often leading to multiple deaths within a single family unit. Imagine Elara's second child, a robust boy. 2 years he thrived, learning to walk, to chase the chickens, to mimic his father in the fields. Elara allowed herself to breathe a little easier, to hope that this one, at least, would survive. Then came the smallpox, its telltale pustules erupting across his skin, bringing with it a searing fever. The helpless mother could only watch as her son's breath grew shallow, his eyes clouded over, and his small hand, which had so recently gripped her finger, grew cold. The village priest spoke of God's will, of souls ascending to heaven, but for Elara it was another raw wound, another empty space at her hearth. This pattern repeated itself across social strata. While the wealthy might afford slightly better food, and perhaps a wider array of herbal remedies from more experienced healers, they were by no means immune. Lady Isolde, the wife of a powerful Norman baron, experienced similar heartbreak. The first 2 pregnancies ended in stillbirths, a devastating blow to her and her husband, who desperately needed an heir to secure his lineage and hold onto his lands. Her third, a fragile daughter, survived only long enough to be baptized before succumbing to a sudden illness, perhaps diphtheria, that closed her tiny throat. For Lady Isolde, the grief was compounded by the intense societal pressure to produce a living, male heir, a burden that weighed heavier with each loss. She lived in a stone castle, not a humble hut, but the invisible killers of 1142 did not discriminate based on wealth or status. The sheer unpredictability of these illnesses added to the terror. A child could seem perfectly healthy one day, full of life and laughter, and be gone the next. There was no understanding of germs, no concept of sanitation as we know it. Waste was often discarded directly into streets or rivers, farm animals shared close quarters with humans, and personal hygiene was rudimentary at best. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A scraped knee could turn gangrenous. Childbirth itself was fraught with peril, both for the mother and the infant. Many newborns simply failed to thrive, victims of complications during birth or infections contracted in their very first days. The sweating sickness could claim a child in a matter of hours, leaving parents stunned and bewildered. So when a woman in 1142 lost not one, but multiple children, it was not an unusual tragedy. It was a tragically common occurrence, a relentless drumbeat of sorrow that echoed across the medieval landscape. The mother who managed to raise even 2 or 3 children to adulthood was considered fortunate, a testament to her endurance and perhaps, in the minds of the people, to divine favor. The reality was a constant battle against unseen forces, a relentless march of invisible killers that shaped lives, destroyed hopes, and forged an enduring legacy of grief. The women of 1142 lived in a world where the future was always uncertain, and the lives of their precious little ones were constantly, terrifyingly vulnerable. Number 6. The crushing weight of medical ignorance. Imagine watching your beloved child gasp for air, their small body racked with fever, and having absolutely no idea why it was happening or how to stop it. For women in 1142, this harrowing helplessness was a daily reality. The state of medical knowledge in the High Middle Ages was, by modern standards, rudimentary at best. There was no germ theory, no understanding of how diseases spread, and certainly no concept of antibiotics or vaccines. Instead, people relied on a complex blend of ancient theories, folk remedies, superstitions, and fervent religious belief, all of which often proved tragically inadequate in the face of widespread childhood diseases. Crushing weight of this medical ignorance meant that mothers were often left to simply witness the slow or swift decline of their children, their hands tied by a lack of effective tools or understanding. Consider the prevailing medical philosophy of the time, the humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of 4 cardinal fluids, or humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of perfect balance among these humors. Illness, therefore, was thought to be an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one humor. Child's fever, for instance, might be attributed to an excess of blood, leading to treatments like bloodletting, where small incisions were made or leeches applied to drain what was believed to be the offending humor. While seemingly logical to the medieval mind, such practices often weakened an already sick child, making them more susceptible to other infections. A mother desperate to save her child might consent to these procedures, believing them to be the only path to recovery, guided by the advice of the local barber surgeon or the village healer. Anna, a baker's wife, remembered her small son Thomas suffering from what was likely pneumonia. He coughed relentlessly, his breathing shallow and labored. The local physician, a man who had some training from a cathedral school, but mostly relied on inherited texts and observation, declared Thomas's illness to be an imbalance of phlegm, suggesting that it was clogging his lungs. He prescribed emetics to induce vomiting, hoping to expel the excess phlegm, and applied warm poultices of various herbs to his chest. Anna meticulously followed these instructions, praying with every breath for the remedies to take hold. She brewed teas from elderflower and mallow, known for their soothing properties, and rubbed the child's chest with goose grease, hoping to ease his congestion. Yet the child only worsened, his breath growing rattier, his fever higher. The physician, baffled, might then resort to further bleeding, or declare the illness to be God's will, a concept that offered spiritual comfort but no medical solution. The role of the village-wise woman or midwife was central to women's lives, particularly concerning children. These women often possessed a deep knowledge of local herbs and traditional remedies, passed down through generations. They understood the properties of comfrey for broken bones, chamomile for upset stomachs, and poppy for pain. However, their knowledge was empirical, not scientific. They knew what seemed to work or what had worked for others, but they had no understanding of dosage, active ingredients, or sterile practices. A mother might be advised to give her child a concoction of brewed willow bark for fever, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, which might offer some relief. For virulent infections, these remedies were often insufficient and sometimes even harmful. The same hands that prepared herbal poultices might also handle animals, unwittingly spreading disease. Consider little Margaret, suffering from what might have been diphtheria. Her throat was swelling, making it agonizingly difficult to swallow. The wise woman might suggest a gargle of vinegar and honey, or a poultice of bread and onions to draw out the inflammation. She might administer powerful purgatives, believing that cleansing the body of impurities would also cleanse it of the sickness. Margaret's mother, filled with terror, would try everything, clutching at any hope. The choking sound of her child's breath would fill the small cottage, a sound that would haunt her for years to come. Doctor, if one was even available in a nearby town, would likely not be able to diagnose the specific disease. They would observe symptoms and relate them to the humoral theory, but the underlying bacterial infection would remain a mystery. Hygiene, a cornerstone of modern health, was practically non-existent. People rarely bathed fully, instead washing hands and faces. Water sources were often shared with animals and susceptible to contamination. Latrines, where they existed, were often primitive and close to water supplies. Childbirth, a moment of extreme vulnerability, was often conducted in unhygienic conditions. Midwives, though skilled in managing births, rarely had sterile instruments or a true understanding of preventing puerperal fever, a deadly infection that could claim both mother and child. A newborn's umbilical stump, a tiny open wound, was susceptible to tetanus, a terrifying killer that caused spasms and rigidity. A mother might wrap the stump with unwashed cloths, unaware of the danger she was unwittingly exposing her child to. This profound medical ignorance meant that mothers were left with very few actionable ways to protect their children. Their efforts were often rooted in love and desperation, rather than effective medical intervention. They cleaned, they prayed, they applied the remedies they knew, but the overwhelming reality was that they were fighting a battle they could not win against unseen enemies. As historian Judith M. Bennett eloquently states in Medieval Women's Lives in Text and Context, the medieval world was one of high death rates, and children were particularly vulnerable, with half or more dying before adolescence. This continuous cycle of birth, hope, illness, and death deeply impacted women, leaving them with an emotional burden compounded by the crushing knowledge that they could do little more than offer comfort and watch their precious ones fade away. Their love was boundless, but their power to save was tragically limited by the vast gulf of medical understanding that separated their time from ours. Number 5. The unseen scars of societal expectation and blame. Imagine being told, subtly or explicitly, that the loss of your children was somehow your fault, a sign of your failing, or even divine punishment. For women in 1142, the profound grief of losing multiple children was often compounded by the crushing weight of societal expectation, and at times, outright blame. A woman's primary role in medieval society, regardless of her social standing, was to produce offspring, particularly male heirs. Failure to do so, or the inability to keep her children alive, could lead to immense social pressure, marital strain, and even a profound sense of personal inadequacy and spiritual guilt. These unseen scars, etched deep into a woman's psyche, were as devastating as the grief itself. Consider the feudal system that dominated much of Europe in 1142. For noblewomen, the production of an heir was paramount. Continuation of the family line, the inheritance of lands and titles, and the very stability of the realm often rested on the birth of a healthy son. Lady Elara, married to a powerful count, understood this burden acutely. She had borne her husband 3 children. The first, a girl, died within weeks of a mysterious ailment. The second, a boy, succumbed to a raging fever at the age of 3. Third, another daughter, was taken by the flux before her first birthday. With each loss, the whispers in the castle grew louder. Her husband, though outwardly sympathetic, grew increasingly distant, his anxiety about the succession palpable. His kinsmen, eager for their own branch of the family to inherit, might subtly suggest that Elara was unfruitful or cursed, a direct assault on her honor and position. Elara felt the weight of their scrutiny, the desperate need to conceive again, to carry a child to term, to deliver a healthy son who would secure her place and her husband's legacy. This pressure transformed her bedroom into a battleground, her body a vessel under constant public scrutiny, not just for the joy of life, but for the stark fear of its loss and the societal repercussions. For peasant women, the pressure was different but equally potent. Children were crucial for labor, for support in old age, and for the continuation of the family's small plot of land. A peasant family with no surviving sons faced a precarious future. Agnes, a farmer's wife, had buried 2 sons and a daughter before they reached the age of 5. Her neighbors, while offering condolences, might also offer unsolicited advice or thinly veiled judgments. Perhaps you worked too hard during pregnancy, one might suggest, implying her physical activity was to blame. Have you displeased God? Another might ask, planting seeds of spiritual guilt. Community, bound by shared struggles, but also by superstition, often sought explanations for misfortune. A mother who repeatedly lost children might be seen as having bad blood, or worse, as having invoked the wrath of God or even suffered from a curse. This was not a scientific age. It was an age of portents and divine intervention, where personal tragedy was often interpreted as a sign of spiritual failing. Church, a dominant force in medieval life, reinforced some of these notions. While offering solace and rituals for the deceased, it also preached about sin and divine judgment. If a woman had lost multiple children, she might internalize the belief that God was testing her faith or even punishing her for some unknown transgression. She might seek penance, make pilgrimages, or offer fervent prayers, hoping to appease a wrathful deity and secure the survival of her next child. This added a profound layer of spiritual anxiety to her already immense grief. She might feel a deep personal guilt, a sense that she was somehow inadequate, that her spiritual standing was flawed, leading to such repeated sorrow. This internal blame was perhaps the most insidious, eroding her self-worth and leaving her feeling unworthy of motherhood. The marital relationship could also suffer immensely under this pressure. While shared grief could forge a stronger bond, repeated loss of heirs could also strain a marriage to its breaking point. A husband, driven by the need for an heir and the desire for continuation of his name, might grow resentful or distant. Though formal divorce was rare and difficult to obtain in Christian Europe, a husband might seek an annulment on grounds of non-consummation, even if children had been born, if they had not survived, or, in extreme cases, simply repudiate his wife, sending her back to her family in shame. This threat loomed over women, particularly those of higher status, who had no male heirs to secure their position. Peasant women, a husband might simply take a concubine or treat his wife with coldness, implicitly blaming her for their misfortunes. The unspoken pressure to conceive again, to produce a living child, often outweighed the genuine desire for comfort or understanding. Historical accounts from the period, though scarce on personal emotional detail, hint at this societal pressure. Charters of inheritance, often modified due to lack of heirs, underscore the material consequences. Church records show women seeking spiritual guidance and performing acts of piety specifically to ensure healthy pregnancy. The lives of women like Elara of Aquitaine, who eventually bore many children, including sons, were marked by initial anxieties over succession. Her very power derived from her ability to produce royal heirs. For women less fortunate, the societal judgment could be devastating. They were expected to be fertile, to be mothers, to be the bearers of the next generation. When this expectation was repeatedly unmet by death, the blame, however unjust, often fell heavily upon their shoulders. These societal pressures created unseen scars, deeper than any physical wound. A woman who lost multiple children not only grieved for her lost ones, but also carried the burden of perceived failure, spiritual guilt, and marital insecurity. She learned to guard her hopes, to steel her heart, not just against the pain of loss, but against the judgment of her community, and perhaps most painfully, her own internal sense of inadequacy. The expectation to keep trying, to put the past behind her, and to focus solely on the next potential pregnancy, denied her the space to fully mourn, creating a cycle of unresolved grief and enduring psychological burden. Number 4, the silent scream of unacknowledged grief. Imagine a grief so profound it threatened to consume you, yet a society that offered no space, no language, and no true understanding for its depth. For women in 1142, losing multiple children meant enduring a sorrow that was often intensely personal and largely unacknowledged by the wider world. While individual compassion might exist, there were no formal rituals, no support systems, and no societal permission for extended mourning as we understand it today. Mothers were expected to be resilient, to endure, and crucially, to look to the future by trying to conceive again. This expectation created a silent scream of unacknowledged grief, trapped within the hearts of countless women. Consider Marie, a young woman who had lost her firstborn daughter within days of her birth, and then her toddler son to a sudden fever. She remembered the warmth of her daughter's skin against hers, the tiny fingers curling around her own. She recalled her son's infectious giggle as he chased a stray cat in the yard. These memories, precious and agonizing, were her sole companions in her darkest moments. After each death, the burial was swift and simple. The small bodies were wrapped in a shroud, often without a coffin, and laid in consecrated ground near the church. The priest offered prayers and the community offered condolences, but these were fleeting gestures. There was no elaborate wake, no prolonged period of public mourning. Life, particularly in a peasant community, had to continue. The fields still needed tending, the animals still needed feeding, the household chores awaited. Marie was expected to return to her duties, to resume her daily grind, as if her world had not been shattered. The expectation to move on was not born of callousness, but of necessity and a different understanding of death. Death, especially in childhood, was so common that it became an inescapable part of life's rhythm. To linger too long in grief was seen as self-indulgent, perhaps even as a sign of weak faith. God's will was paramount, and accepting it was a virtue. While a mother's heart undeniably ached, she was encouraged to seek solace in prayer, to believe her children were now saints in heaven, and to focus her energy on the next potential pregnancy. This practical approach, however, did not erase the agonizing emptiness. Marie would perform her chores with a vacant stare, her hands moving mechanically, while her mind replayed the last moments of her children's lives. She might sit by their tiny graves in the quiet moments after sunset, whispering words of love and sorrow, tears streaming down her face, unseen by anyone but the fading light. There was no concept of grief counseling, no understanding of the psychological impact of repeated trauma. A woman might turn to her husband, but men, too, were conditioned to be stoic, to focus on the practicalities of survival and succession. While they undoubtedly grieved, their expression of it might be limited, and their expectation for their wives was often to regain their strength and fertility quickly. Agnes, who had lost 3 children, remembered her husband's quiet sorrow, but also his gentle reminders that God will bless us again, and we must look to the future. He meant well, but his words inadvertently minimized her current pain, leaving her feeling isolated in her despair. She might confide in a close female relative or friend, but even then, the conversation would likely be brief, punctuated by shared laments and then a return to the demands of daily life. The very language of grief was different. While sorrow was acknowledged, the deep, complex psychological processes we now understand as grief were not articulated. There was no permission to feel angry, to question fate, or to openly rage against the injustice of it all. These emotions, if they arose, had to be suppressed, deemed inappropriate or even sinful. The burden of this suppression was immense. A mother might find herself crying silently into her pillow at night, or suddenly overwhelmed by a memory during the day, forcing herself to quickly compose her features before anyone noticed. This constant emotional vigilance prevented true healing, leaving deep, unseen scars on her soul. Art and literature of the period, though largely created by men and focused on religious or heroic themes, occasionally offer glimpses into the profound sorrow. Depictions of the Lamentation of Christ, with Mary holding her dead son, resonated deeply with medieval mothers, offering a sacred mirror to their own suffering. These were symbolic representations, not guides for personal emotional processing. A woman's grief for her lost children was her own, a private crucible in which she wrestled with her pain, her faith, and her desperate longing. The societal expectation to simply move on, to re-engage with the cycle of procreation, meant that women rarely had the luxury of protracted mourning. They might wear simple, somber clothing for a brief period, but life's demands pulled them forward. The sheer necessity of continuing the lineage, of providing labor, and of maintaining the household superseded the need for emotional recovery. This silent scream, this unacknowledged grief, accumulated with each loss, creating a profound emotional burden. The memory of each child, the fleeting joys they brought, and the agonizing void they left behind remained forever etched in the mother's heart, a collection of silent sorrows carried through a lifetime. often without external validation or understanding. This resilience, born of necessity, came at a heavy cost to the inner lives of these women, leaving them with deep, unspoken wounds that never fully healed. Number 3, the economic earthquake of lost hands. Imagine a family's survival, their very livelihood, depending on the number of hands available to work the land, to churn the butter, to weave the cloth. Now imagine those hands, those promised futures, being snatched away not once, but multiple times. For women in 1142, the loss of multiple children was not only an emotional catastrophe, but also an economic earthquake that threatened the very foundation of their family's survival. In an agrarian society, children were not just loved, they were essential economic assets, and their absence created immediate and long-term financial insecurity, placing an immense, silent burden on the shoulders of the mother. Consider the life of a peasant family. Their wealth was measured not in coins, but in the yield of their crops, the health of their livestock, and crucially, the number of able bodies available to contribute to the arduous work of daily life. From a young age, children were integrated into the household economy. A small child, barely old enough to walk, might be tasked with gathering firewood or tending to the chickens. As they grew, they would graduate to more demanding chores, boys helping in the fields with plowing, planting, and harvesting, girls learning to spin wool, weave cloth, churn butter, and manage the household. Every child represented a potential future helper, a pair of hands that would ease the burden on their parents and eventually support them in their old age. Elara, the peasant woman we met earlier, understood this stark reality. After losing her first daughter and then her first son, she felt not only the wrenching pain of maternal grief, but also a tightening knot of anxiety in her stomach. Who would help her husband with the heavy labor in the fields when he grew old, who would carry on their small family plot. Her third child, a lively boy named Finn, seemed promising. He was sturdy, quick-witted, and showed a keen interest in helping his father with the oxen. Elara saw in him the future of their family, the security they longed for. Then the summer fever came, swift and unforgiving, taking Finn at the age of 6. The silence in the cottage after his death was not just the absence of a child's laughter, it was the chilling sound of a future unwritten, a promise broken. Elara looked at her husband, his shoulders slumped, and knew that they would have to work even harder, that their old age would be one of greater hardship, with fewer hands to provide comfort and sustenance. For women, this economic burden was particularly acute because of their role in the household and family planning. While men were the primary farmers or tradesmen, women managed the household economy, from preparing food and making clothes to raising children, who would eventually become part of the labor force. The loss of a child meant not only lost future labor, but also the immediate cost of birth and burial. While a peasant burial was simple, it still involved a shroud, perhaps a small offering to the church, and the time taken away from labor to mourn. For a family living on the edge of subsistence, every loss, even a small cost, was a significant blow. The impact also extended to the long-term future. Without surviving children, particularly sons, a family lineage might end, and their land might revert to the Lord upon the parents' deaths. This was a terrifying prospect for families who had worked generations to eke out a living from the same soil. Daughters, while not direct field labor in the same way as sons, they were still vital for household management, childcare, and eventually, forming alliances through marriage and dowries. The loss of a daughter meant losing a potential future dowry, a means to improve the family's social standing or secure a future connection. Even for noble families, the economic impact was profound, though different. Lady Isolde, the baron's wife, understood that without a surviving male heir, her husband's lands could be disputed, potentially reverting to the crown or being divided among distant relatives. Personal future was tied to this as well. Without an heir, her position within the family and court was precarious. Each lost child was a direct threat to the family's wealth, power, and legacy. Costs associated with noble births, including elaborate christenings, wet nurses, and servants, were substantial. Losing a child after such an investment was not only heartbreaking, but also a significant financial setback. As medieval economic historians like Professor Richard Britnell, in The Commercialization of English Society, 1000 to 1500, explain, children were indeed considered valuable assets in the medieval economy. Their labor contribution started early, and their survival was directly linked to the household's prosperity and stability. Burden of replacing lost children, of conceiving again and again in the hope of raising strong, healthy individuals, fell disproportionately on women. Their bodies were seen as tools for production, not just of life, but of future economic security. Thus, when a woman in 1142 lost multiple children, she bore not only the crushing weight of grief and societal blame, but also the very real and immediate fear of economic ruin. The empty cradles were not just symbols of lost love, they were stark reminders of lost labor, lost future support, and a precarious existence that teetered on the edge of destitution. Constant pressure to conceive, to carry a child to term, to raise them past the perilous years of infancy, was driven by a deeply ingrained understanding that the survival of her family, her very own future, depended on the hands that would otherwise be missing from her home. This economic earthquake reverberated through every aspect of her life, adding another layer of silent, enduring anxiety to her already profound sorrow. Number 2, the silent strain on marriage and lineage. Imagine your most sacred bond, your marriage, constantly tested by a tragedy that struck at its very core, the inability to nurture and sustain the next generation. For women in 1142, the loss of multiple children exerted immense and often silent strain on their marriages, reshaping family dynamics and raising existential questions about lineage and purpose. In a society where marriage was often a strategic alliance for property, power, or labor, and children were the primary means of securing these interests, repeated infant and child mortality could fracture even the strongest bonds, leaving women vulnerable and their futures uncertain. Consider the primary purpose of marriage in medieval society: procreation. While love and companionship certainly existed, the practical necessity of producing heirs was paramount, particularly for the elite, but also for peasant families needing labor. When a woman repeatedly lost children, the pressure mounted, not just from the wider community, but from within the marital relationship itself. A husband, driven by the intense desire for a son to carry on his name and inherit his lands, might become distant, frustrated, or even resentful. This was not always malicious. It stemmed from the deep societal imperative to continue the lineage. Lady Isolde, the baron's wife, experienced this acutely. After burying 3 children, none of whom were healthy enough to survive infancy or early childhood, the silence in the castle grew heavy, permeated by her husband's quiet anxieties. He was a proud man, deeply invested in his family's honor and future. His friends, other lords and knights, would subtly inquire about his heir, further fueling his distress. While Lady Isolde grieved deeply, her husband's grief often manifested as a renewed urgency, a desperate need for another pregnancy. He would seek counsel from learned men, from the church, perhaps even from strange healers, hoping to find a remedy for what was perceived as a failing in their marriage, rather than a cruel twist of fate. This pressure to conceive again, often immediately after a loss, denied Lady Isolde the time to truly mourn, her body and mind constantly on edge, preparing for the next potential pregnancy, another chance to secure her place and her husband's legacy. For peasant women, the strain was different but equally devastating. Agnes, the farmer's wife, whose sons had died young, understood that her husband needed male heirs to work their land. His quiet disappointment, his tired sighs after another day in the fields, were a constant reminder of the burden of lost hands. While repudiation was less common among peasants than among the nobility, the emotional distance could be profound. A husband might seek comfort elsewhere, or simply become more focused on his work, leaving his wife isolated in her sorrow. Communal understanding was that a woman was meant to bear children, and if those children did not survive, it was a mark against her perceived fruitfulness. This could lead to a subtle but pervasive sense of shame and inadequacy within the marriage, eroding the intimacy and partnership. The church, while providing moral guidance, also allowed for some extreme measures in cases of barrenness or lack of surviving heir. Though outright divorce was almost impossible in Christian Europe, annulments could sometimes be granted on specific grounds, such as non-consummation, or even in practice, if no children were produced over a prolonged period. This created a terrifying possibility for women of high status, the threat of being sent back to their natal families in disgrace, stripped of their marital rights and social standing. The lack of heirs was not just a personal sorrow, it was a potential catastrophe for a woman's entire life. As Professor Christine Klaipisch-Zuber details in her work, Women, Family, and Ritual in Renaissance Italy, even though her focus is later, the underlying pressures on marriage and lineage from infant mortality were deeply rooted in medieval society. The desire for a continuous bloodline was fundamental to property ownership, social order, and political power. When death repeatedly severed that line, the very purpose of a marriage was called into question. The grieving process itself could also divide couples. While some shared their sorrow and found strength in unity, others found themselves grieving in different ways, leading to misunderstanding and emotional distance. The woman might dwell on the lost future, the physical presence of the child. The man might focus on the economic and societal implications. These differing manifestations of grief, coupled with the immense pressure to move on and try again, could create a profound chasm between partners, leaving the woman feeling profoundly alone in her sorrow. Ultimately, the silent strain on marriage and lineage was a devastating consequence of losing multiple children in 1142. Added another layer of anxiety and vulnerability to a woman's life. Personal grief was intertwined with her social role and her husband's dynastic hopes. The empty cradle was not just a symbol of a lost child, but a constant, painful reminder of a fundamental challenge to her marriage, her status, and the very continuation of her family's name. This created an unspoken tension, a deep-seated fear that haunted women throughout their childbearing years, pushing them into a relentless cycle of pregnancy and loss, with their marital future often hanging in the balance. Number 1, the embrace of fatalism and desperate spiritual seeking. Imagine a world where medicine failed, where societal expectations crushed, and where grief had no true outlet. In such a world, what do you turn to when the unthinkable happens, not once, but repeatedly? For women in 1142, losing multiple children often led to a profound embrace of fatalism, coupled with an intense and desperate spiritual seeking. With so little control over disease and death, the medieval mind often attributed these tragedies to divine will, curses, or supernatural forces. This worldview, while offering a framework for understanding the inexplicable, also fostered a sense of helplessness and propelled mothers into fervent, often desperate, acts of piety and superstition in their desperate quest for survival and solace. Consider the pervasive influence of the church in medieval life. From birth to death, every aspect of existence was infused with religious significance. When a child died, particularly in infancy, the prevailing belief was that their soul ascended directly to heaven, unburdened by sin. This offered immense comfort to grieving parents. A mother like Elara, burying her third child, might find solace in the priest's words, envisioning her tiny ones playing in the celestial gardens, watched over by angels. However, this comfort often came with a heavy side of fatalism. Was God's will, then what could a mere mortal do to prevent it? This passive acceptance, while easing the burden of personal blame in some ways, also disempowered women, reinforcing the idea that they were ultimately at the mercy of divine decree. Yet, this fatalism did not preclude desperate seeking. For many women, particularly those who had lost multiple children, their faith became a battleground of hope and despair. They might interpret repeated losses as a test of their faith, a divine punishment for some unknown sin, or even a sign of demonic interference. This spurred them to increasingly fervent and often superstitious acts of devotion. Agnes, after burying 2 sons, began to meticulously light a candle every Sunday at the church altar, praying to Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of children, for the survival of her next pregnancy. She vowed to make a pilgrimage to a local shrine if her next child survived infancy, believing that a grand gesture of piety would finally appease God and guarantee a healthy outcome. The line between piety and superstition was often blurred in the medieval mind. Women might carry amulets blessed by a priest or even local, cunning folk, believing they possessed protective powers against illness or evil spirits. They might hang garlands of garlic or herbs above a child's cradle, convinced it would ward off malevolent influences or the dreaded changeling myth, where a fairy child was believed to be swapped for a human infant. While these were not sanctioned by the church, they were common folk practices, born of desperation and the inherent human need to feel some control over an uncontrollable world. A mother desperate to save her child would clutch at any straw, no matter how small or seemingly irrational, if it offered even a glimmer of hope. Historians like Caro Baroja in his studies of European witchcraft and popular beliefs often highlight the mixture of Christian faith and older folk practices that coexisted, particularly among women seeking remedies for illness and misfortune. For a woman watching her child fade, prayers to Mary, the compassionate mother, were constant. She might promise special fasts, donate her meager savings to the church, or make elaborate vows in exchange for her child's life. The intensity of these spiritual bargains reflected the depths of her despair and the lack of alternative solutions. Every new pregnancy was accompanied by renewed prayers, increased piety, and often new superstitious rituals, as if trying to stack the odds in her favor against an invisible, powerful adversary. This spiritual seeking could also lead to extreme acts of self-sacrifice. A mother might offer her own pain or suffering as a penance, hoping to atone for sins she might not even know she committed, in exchange for her child's health. Constant fear of the next loss fueled a relentless spiritual quest, transforming women's lives into a continuous cycle of hope, prayer, and resigned acceptance when those prayers went unanswered. Fatalism was not a passive indifference. It was a deeply emotional surrender to a power perceived as absolute, a power that could bestow life and snatch it away with equal, terrifying ease. The embrace of fatalism and desperate spiritual seeking was, in a way, a coping mechanism for women in 1142. It offered a framework for understanding unbearable suffering, even if that framework was one of divine mystery or supernatural malevolence. It allowed them to direct their immense love and anxiety into tangible, though often ineffective, actions. But it also left them with the ultimate powerlessness, the knowledge that despite all their prayers, all their offerings, and all their desperate measures, the outcome remained largely beyond their control. This spiritual journey, often solitary and profound, became another layer of their identity, shaping their worldview and their enduring resilience in the face of repeated, inexplicable loss. The women of 1142 lived, grieved, and hoped under the vast, often inscrutable shadow of a world where life was fragile, and death was an ever-present, terrifying, and divinely ordained reality.